Welcome to Keen on Retirement, a show dedicated to helping you thrive before and during your retirement years. If you are looking to grow and protect your wealth and want to make the second half of your life the best half, then listen in as wealth advisor Bill Keen sorts through the key issues that you need to know in a lively and candid way.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Keen on Retirement. I'm your co-host, Steve Sandusky, and with me is Bill Keen and a very special guest here, Bill. So we're going to introduce Joseph here in just a quick second, but every once in a while, we'll bring on a special guest, and we've gotten a chance to get to know Joe here recently, and we're excited to bring him here to the Keen on Retirement audience.
Yeah, yes, we are. As we've shared over many years with our listeners and viewers, now we have quite a following on our YouTube channel. And I would encourage you to click over to the YouTube channel if you haven't, because we do some fun things here on video as well. So you get to see our smiling faces. But, kind of the concept when we rolled this out 12 years ago, Steve, you might recall, it was, we realized our friends of the firm and clients really wanted to look behind the curtain at what we were seeing in our practice and firm year over year. So we created this, going on 300 episodes now, 12 years, and bringing guests on that have a real insight into historical concepts and different things. We've had Dr. Daniel Crosby on. We've had Jeff Lanza of the FBI on. We've talked a lot about behavioral psychology and some of the other works that are out there. We haven't had Morgan Housel on yet, but we've talked a lot about his work. And I think Joseph's friends with Morgan. I might have seen that in a prior episode I watched of his podcast. So without further ado, I'll let you introduce Joseph, because I'm really excited that he was willing to come on our program after all the great work he's done and his best-selling authorship.
Exactly. So yes, our guest is Joseph Moore, PhD. And Joseph, you've written a new book here called How to Get Rich in American History, 300 Years of Financial Advice That Worked and Didn't. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, we often talk about how there's timeless financial advice. And yes, I think we'd all agree that there is some advice out there that pretty much is timeless and has transcended not only decades, but actually centuries where it's actually worked. But there's been other advice in years past that we thought worked and were worked for the times, but may not work today. So we're going to talk about both of those. So Joseph, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Bill, Steve, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for the conversation, and thanks for what you're doing to help people.
Yeah. Let's just start with the book itself in terms of what prompted you to write this particular book.
So I'll try to do this. The backstory quickly is it's 2005. I'm getting a PhD in history, not financial history, by the way, just like something else. And back then, if you remember, the lesson of history was clear. Renting is throwing your money away. And instead of thinking about it like a historian, I nodded my head like everyone else was nodding their head in 2005, signed the paperwork for the mortgage on the house that we were graduate students and had no business owning. And it's 2008. You fast forward, I think that was actually 06. And then 08 comes along, and a friend at church offered a personal finance class. And we went as a favor. They made us do a budget. I went home. I did not sleep. I paced this tiny townhome we had bought despite having no income, and thought, who gave us a mortgage? And so we sold our house. I distinctly remember that it closed on a Saturday because our neighbor put her house on the market the next Saturday and it did not sell. We were the last two people off the Titanic in 08. And as I watched the economy crumble, I thought, I didn't think like a historian. I want to know, why did I believe what I was told to do with money? And what have other people been told to do? And what's the good parts and what's the bad parts? And can we learn from looking at what people were told to do with their money over time? I kind of thought I would find one clear story all the way through. I did not. I found a lot of change. I think, sometimes people think about a financial advisor and what that role is. And I tell people a lot of the role is explaining that change is constant. And so you have to be adaptable to that change. That's why you need a plan to be adaptable to change. The plan isn't locked in stone.
That's right.
Because if you go to 1912, I promise you, 1912, everybody knew what the financial playbook was. Everyone knew what it was. It was save $100, usually in what's called a charity bank. It was buy a life insurance policy, and then it was put a mortgage on a house. Then it was pay the house as fast as possible, even if you have to rent the rooms in that sucker. to pay that mortgage. And then what you do with your free money is you lend it out to other people's mortgages. This is the standard, everybody knows to do it playbook in 1912, because you live in a world with no inflation. And so lending out money at steady interest or buying bonds at steady interest made total sense. In fact, 1912, sorry, I'm jumping right in here, but I just want to understand this idea of change and how what always worked was always changing. So in 1912, that's the standard playbook. And you can buy bonds at 4 and 5% and sit by the fire in peace because there's zero inflation. Zero. If you go back, there's a gallon of milk costs 24 cents a gallon. If I go back in time 100 years to 1812, Napoleon rules France, men wear hose, right? That's 1812. A gallon of milk was 24 cents a gallon. So there's been no inflation for 100 years. There's been deflation and some coming back. That playbook worked for that period. And then inflation went from 0 to 8, like double where we are now. 18, 17, 15, 15 in 5 years. And there was not a mother, a grandmother, or a great-grandmother who knew what to do. And so all of the financial advice had to change to adapt to change. And we see this over and over. Is like we think we know what to do, and then things change. And you have to have a plan that stays adaptable to that historical change. And that's really what I wanted to do with the book.
Yeah, and I appreciate you setting that context because, the most successful investors, the most successful people, in life, period, are the ones who are really adaptable and who are able to sense, okay, this is good, solid advice. This works. But at some point, sometimes, things change. Mm-hmm. And we can't always rely on, well, it worked historically, so it's going to work in the future. I think artificial intelligence is a great example. There might be things that worked really well in a pre-AI world, but now that we have AI, things are going to be different. And so it takes a discerning mind to help figure out what might stay the same because of AI, what might improve because of AI, what may no longer work because of AI, and what new opportunities are now available that never were available in a pre-AI world. And I think, again, financial advisors are in a great position to really help clients think through, at least as it relates to the financial life, what are some things that we need to think about in this type of environment.
Mm-hmm. Steve, our last series of blogs, which come out on the off weeks from the podcast, so every 2 weeks a blog comes out, have literally been for the last probably 8 or 10 weeks on that adaptability and financial planning. Remember, there's not one number. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to jump ahead today because some of the points might be in congruence and alignment with Joseph's work, but it was those topics exactly, that being able to be adaptable. And Joseph, I have to ask you, your training in history. Well, look, you're a best-selling author now on a financial topic because it's fascinating. The themes that you've gotten to see, it had to be so illuminating to go back and see the trends and see the different things that came back into favor, the different things that were in and out and back, and some went away forever, and some, it just had to be fascinating. And when did you realize, I guess you just told us, it was 2005 when you realized that there was certainly an intersection between your history and how you could think about your finances.
Yeah, it was really, so you go to 2008 and then I'm looking around going, I need to know what happened, not just to me, but to Americans. And then I think and I had a great conversation with some folks recently about this, where I said, everybody else that I normally have a conversation with came through the finance door. Right. If you think about the kind of economic conversations that are happening in a party, most people came through the front door. One was called finance, one was maybe another one's called economics, business, whatever. There's some traditional. I came through the back basement because I was studying social history. And the thing about social history that's different than maybe traditional popular histories is that you looked at the actual lived experience of people. You don't go from the theory to what it should do. You go from what happened to people to what they were thinking and doing. And so because of that, I kind of came at it almost from a very different direction than most studies. And I think that's why I was able to kind of pick up on some themes other people weren't picking up on, because so I'll give you an example it seems somewhat random, but when I was looking for financial advice, starting from today going backwards, and the trail went cold. Like if this was a murder mystery, we have lost the villain and we can't find him, right? We have no evidence, no trail, no footsteps. And through some random conversation, somebody said, have you looked at housewife manuals? And I thought, No, I have not. So I went and I pulled up, there were these things that were very popular for over 100 years, actually about 200 years, called housewife manuals. They're exactly what they sound like. You are a young 20-year-old woman who has just gotten married, and you have to know how to do everything. This is what the recipes are. This is how to clean clothes. This is how to dress a snake bite, because you're in Wyoming. There's nowhere to go for help. You got to know how to do it yourself. And so women would be given these housewife manuals. They were very popular, and almost every one of them has a chapter, if not more, on financial investments, on what to do with the family's money. And that was when it was a treasure trove, because they were everywhere. Women and families were thinking about these problems all the time, and they were seen as a family issue. They weren't an individual issue. It wasn't just, I'm this traditional idea we have, like, I'm the man, I handle the money, and like my poor little wife has no idea what's going on. No, they are sitting, just like we do today, at the kitchen table running a small nonprofit trying to figure this thing out. and so it was in women's manuals that I found these very rich, detailed conversations about what to do with money, what made sense when. And they were incredibly sophisticated compared to what I thought I was going to find. And so, things like that other people hadn't been looking there because that wasn't the story we're told.
Well, Joseph, I promise we're going to get to the book here, but you've given so many good threads here that I really want to go down here if we can for just a moment. So, social history. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background there in terms of, here we are in 2026. And from a social historian, what do you see happening today if you were to flash forward 50 years or 100 years from now, and you were a social historian 100 years from now, looking back to 2026, what are some things that you think you might be saying about our environment today? And if there's any way to connect that to how we think about money, that would give you bonus points.
That's great. No, I think, change, I talk about this in the book. I talk about fast time change and slow time change. And everybody worries about fast time change because that's the one that we're told to be scared of, right? It's always 1929. It's always 2008. Everybody, everything changes everywhere all at once. And like the stories that we hear in those histories are very dramatic. A handful of smart people saw it coming. Everybody else got taken out. We just don't want to be the ones that get taken out. So we're constantly like looking around for signs of fast change. The problem with that kind of history is they're not meant to teach you what to do with your money. They're written to entertain you, right? Like there's a reason those books are at the top of the bestseller lists and that they're the movies everybody remembers watching because Selena Gomez blew on the dice and explained mortgage-backed securities, right? Like it's because it was there to entertain us. But most of your financial life is not lived that way. Most of your life does have change. It's slow time change where things move incrementally based on what makes sense in each moment. And over time, that becomes a different system. And I think the things you look for are where is the system starting to change in ways that what we call by one name is actually operating in a completely different way. And so if I think about when I hear people talk about stock market histories, I go, well, when was the stock market? There's kind of a ship of Theseus problem that if you go to 1976, which is literally the bicentennial year, you get the index revolution, right? We have this arrival of the passive index fund. Well, how many Americans are investing in stocks in 1976? 10% of Americans. Today, it's well over 60%. So when we talk about investing and how it changes over time, and passive indexing is a good example of that, it went from being the ant on the back of an elephant. This is in my lifetime because I was born in the 70s. It went from being the ant on the back of an elephant whose only job was to get a free ride, which is an amazing thing, right? Because there's this huge market doing all the work of price discovery and risk allocation and all these things. Now, a huge portion of that market we talk about is itself passive. And it happened right as we lived, right? As we all lived our lives. And that it could work very, very well for a very long time, but it is different. And so like if you can identify the way the average American in 1976 is not sending money into a 401k because there aren't 401ks, right? They're just trusting that Studebaker is going to make good on their pension plan, which, by the way, Studebaker did not make good on their pension plan promises, which is another thing. People will yearn for a time in history, back in the day, when I was taken care of by a pension. Well, which pension? Because not all of them made good on their promises. And a lot of people found that out the hard way after working for 30-something years. The people of South Bend, Indiana, have that scarred into their collective memory because that's where Studebaker had their plant. So I look back at the past and say, how do we call it the same name but it changed imperceptibly over time till it became something different. In terms of what's happening now, I think index funds is a good example. I do think some of the stuff people say is new is actually really old, like meme stock investing and Kalshi.
Right.
I can give you Kalshi from the 1800s. I can talk about that. But
Really? Okay.
yeah, but I think at the end of the day, we are having a different family dynamic and structure that's dramatically different than it was in the 1970s or 60s or anything like that. And so as we see less and less young people coupling, as we see less and less people getting married, as we see a slowly shifting demographic to less and less kids, there's no population implosion about to happen, no matter what somebody tells you, because the generation behind Gen X is huge. They're the pig in the poke. But as baby boomers do eventually go off of that demographic chart, there is some demographic change behind the Gen Zers that'll be interesting. So I think we have these, but again, they're slow. They don't happen overnight. And what I find is, and I'll close with this, people, they go on a business trip or a family trip, they're on the plane and they watch The Big Short again because, it's an easy movie to watch on the plane, and they come back terrified that the world's about to end. And like they go to their financial advisor and get me out of everything. No, that's fast time change. Most of the change is really slow.
All right. Well, let's dig into the book here a little bit. And the way that I'm going to frame this is we're walking through a museum, and there's a number of different exhibits related to ideas and things that you talk about in your book. And I'd like you to talk about the exhibits. So if we go to a museum, oftentimes we're going to have, the modern art section, the contemporary art section, maybe a medieval art section, maybe a, prehistoric art section. So it runs the gamut across centuries, and some of it still makes sense today. Some of it is, we don't see that kind of art made anymore. So one exhibit that we walk across here is the Don't Save Money exhibit. So that's something you talk about in your book. Tell me about the context around, was that good advice at some point in time? And should we follow that advice today?
So let's start there. I love this idea of having the Kandinskys beside the
Kandinsky.
Monets. I like this. So if my dad walks into my house and sits his grandkids down and says, "No, children, whatever you do with money, never save it," I'm going to ask Dad to step away from the bottle and from the kids. It's like, Dad, that's terrible advice now, but it was not terrible advice in the 1800s. And this gets back to this idea of comparing eras is much trickier than people act like it is. So if I go to the middle of the 1800s, all the way to the dawn of the Civil War, there are over 10,000 separate self-issued currencies in the United States. You know who's not issuing a currency? The federal government. There is no U.S. dollar. There are dollars in the U.S. Many of them come from banks. Some of them come from companies who could issue money. Some of them come from private individuals. You could go out and issue a currency in the same way you could go out and issue a cryptocurrency today, that you could just make it up and then say it's redeemable by what I say it's redeemable by. My favorite example of this is a runaway slave from Kentucky named William Wells Brown. He runs away from slavery. He gets as far as Monroe, Michigan, and he gets stuck. He knows nobody. He has no money. And he's technically illegal, right? Like he is running from the law. And a landlord takes mercy on him and says, "Hey, I'll rent you this space in my shop, my storefront, and you can start a barber shop and get on your feet." This is a fabulous idea with only 3 problems. Number 1, he has never cut hair in his life. Number 2, he does not own scissors. Number 3, no one in town can pay him. Now, he borrows the scissors, and then he doesn't tell anybody he's never done this. In fact, he paints this huge sign on the front that says "Hairdresser from New York." He's never been to New York, but nobody asks. And he puts it up there. But then what do you do with that? The money situation. He goes to a printer and he says, "Will you print me money?" Small denomination, 6 cents, 12 cents, 15 cents, up to $1. And then he goes around town and he uses this to pay for food, to pay for lodging. Basically, it's redeemable at my shop. And as long as he can make good on that, it's money. And for about a year in Monroe, Michigan, this starts to circulate so that, look, I've already got all the haircuts I need, but you haven't. So I'm going to hand it to you and you give me bread. Nothing against Steve's haircut. That's not meant personally. But this starts to happen and people use and then eventually he gets enough better money, skips town to get to actual New York and freedom. The money goes to zero. This happened all the time. Immigrants were especially prone to not know the rules of the game. And so they would save in cash for a year after getting here, only to find out that whoever had issued the bank, the business that had issued that money had gone bust. And now it was all worthless. So the advice, and I literally have a grandfather in the book who sits his grandkid down and says, grandson, the trick with money, spend it as fast as you can, never save it. Because that's, if I go to work and I get paid in Dogecoin, and you go to work and get paid in Fartcoin, which is a real cryptocurrency.
Oh boy.
You are going to spend it as fast as you can because you do not want to be holding that when it goes down. And so that's the way their economy worked. So the advice fit the economy. And it made perfect sense. Good advice then, terrible advice now, because money was a different thing.
Love it.
Yeah. And again, perfect example of the context. Back in the 1800s, don't save because the money could be worthless the next day. Today, obviously, we give opposite advice. We have a centralized currency here through the U.S. government. And so it's a totally different situation. So appreciate you sharing that example.
I love before you go to the next one, Steve, I would just say, I love you painting that picture because we all think the system right now is maybe it's rigged or the Fed should be doing this or they're not acting appropriately or the system, and we have some inflation, which we do. But man, compared, our system now doesn't sound too awfully bad after getting to hear that story.
And that is exactly what the first people who got the greenback dollar felt like. They felt like they had this huge, amazing step forward. Yes, it had flaws. And yes, especially once you get the Federal Reserve. Okay, but I can plan for 3%, money destruction. I can't plan for from par to zero. And so it's not perfect. I'm not trying to suggest to anyone, and everyone has very strong opinions about the Federal Reserve.
Right.
All right. None of which I'm not going to solve anybody's, I'm not going to be anybody's clairvoyant voice on that, but it is at least a more manageable system than it used to be. And I think we take that for granted.
Yeah. I think oftentimes we do. Okay. A second exhibit that we're going to walk into here is the financial heirlooms exhibit. And this has to do with, say, the money scripts, the beliefs that maybe a grandparent leaves with their children or their grandchildren, and oftentimes the environment that we grow up around and the words and the phrases that are drilled into us, like money doesn't grow on trees, that sort of thing, can sometimes carry with us for the rest of our life. So how should we think about this idea of financial heirlooms?
What a great question. So I think this is really unique because every generation has its own lived experience that lasts roughly 40 to 70 years, right? Like I don't mean like 40 years old, but like as in you kind of have an adulthood that spans a certain moment of history and you learn what worked and didn't. And then you kind of look in the rearview mirror when people ask you for advice to tell you how the road went. But the problem is the road's going forward. And so every generation offers up what worked for its generation doesn't always work for the next generation. But we just talked about one, obviously, with grandparents saying don't save money. There's the one I talked about earlier in 1912. Everyone would have told you to buy bonds. Like it was just a no-brainer. Why would you not take a guaranteed 4 to 5% return in a safe, inflation-free environment? That's a great way for grandma to sit by the fire in peace. And then it stopped working. And so, here's some other ones. If I go to stocks, dividends were most of returns for most of history. And so the advice you would have gotten from that period I talked about, the 19-teens, all the way until the early 1980s, was that the kind of stocks you wanted were good, steady dividend stocks. Because from the Washington administration until Michael Jackson's Thriller album, not making those dates up, those are the exact dates, from the Washington administration to the Thriller album, the over 90% of returns from stocks came from dividends. But from that point forward, dividends are very little of the return on stocks, and it's almost all price appreciation. So to your example, if I go to somebody in the 1960s and I say, what type of stock or 1950s especially, they would say good, solid dividend stocks. And all that advice is wrapped up in PE ratios and stock dividends. And then that advice stops working because they start rewarding the stockholder a different way. That's the kind of the ones that pop to mind quickest of just things that we're absolutely certain that always works. So we tell our kids and grandkids that's what works. And then something else starts working.
Yeah. And I mean, I always find it fascinating about the generational differences. So I think about like grandparents who may have grown up during the Depression. And so it's their very formative years was really difficult. And so they save everything. They never throw anything away. So they almost become hoarders. And even into their later life, as they're in their 80s and 90s, they can't spend any money because they're afraid that it may go away. And they remember when they had no money. And now maybe they have a whole bunch of money, but they don't want to spend it because they still remember when they didn't have money. So, and then, you go to today's, young generation, people in their 20s, and they grow up on TikTok and Instagram, and they see all these finfluencers on TikTok that are, giving these, 5-second sound bites or 10-second little video clips type thing on what to do with your money. So it's just a really interesting contrast among the generations. It's also a contrast with the technology that is available at that point in time in terms of how to communicate. And you have all these different cross currents that are going on as well while all these things are happening. And it makes the financial advisor's job, I think, a little more difficult because if they do have clients that range from someone in their 70s and 80s versus someone that might be in their 40s, really rising stars in their careers, those are very different generations, very different lived experiences. And so you have to work with them differently and think about what are the beliefs and the scripts that have sort of been drilled into them as they've grown up.
One of the great things about history is it humbles you, right? You learn from other people's lives that you haven't seen everything. I think that's one of the real values history brings. And so here's another example of that. The generation who lived through the Depression, by and large, were extremely debt averse. I mean, at an almost obsessive level, they struggled to take on debt or to have a comfort level with taking on debt. Obviously, the baby boomers did not inherit that problem. And so, but like I remember my grandfather he was in debt exactly one time in his entire life after the Depression. And that was when he bought on a VA mortgage, the home that I remember, my grandparents' house, 15-year mortgage. And my grandmother, the first week they were in the house, woke up and he wasn't there. And she's like, it's a tiny house. You're talking about 800 and something square feet, right? So she walks down the tiny hallway to the kitchen and he's there with scribbling with a notepad. The payment was $64.64. And she said he was mumbling to himself, $64.64, $64. He could not believe he owed this money and he had to figure out, he paid it off in under 7 years. Like that. So that was his generation, right? Now, you go to the next generation, go to like Sylvia Porter, who used to be, before Dave Ramsey was Dave Ramsey or Susie Orman was Susie Orman, right? Sylvia Porter was the personal finance guru of America. She's largely forgotten today. She was like, go in debt. Like she had no problems with debt. She was like very comfortable telling people to like buy the couch on debt or whatever. So it's like generationally, these things change. And what seems to make sense for each generation makes sense for that generation.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have the buy now, pay later firms. Like those are big companies these days. And I guess, when I was growing up, we used to call that layaway.
Yeah. I remember layaway.
Right? Yep. So, and Bill, I think you have, was it your aunt or great aunt that worked at the big department store there in Kansas City or?
Oh, yes. She worked at Emery Bird Thayer, an iconic department store here, closed in 1968. She was born in 1901 and passed in 2001. We did a whole episode on her and what she saw in her lifetime, right? She was 28 years old when she went through the Great Depression. And lived a very a wonderful life and was a great mentor to me, but did very well as a woman in those timeframes. She was the vice president of HR at that department store for something like 25 years and really, really did phenomenal. But seeing her pension check was $63 a month, to your point on that payment, it's interesting to put all that in context. I learned a lot from her, though, in the spirit of what we're speaking of today, just her life and her history and her sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's walk through another exhibit here. And this is a concept that we talk about frequently as financial professionals. And this is the Diversify Everything exhibit. And so, Joseph, I think you have some thoughts on this idea of diversification versus concentration. So how has the thinking around those things, how does that evolve over time?
Yeah, so I think this is an importantly nuanced conversation. So make sure people follow the whole arc here. Do not confuse what the rich have with what the rich did to have it. Meaning the way people got ahead for most of American history was not diversification. In fact, there's some pretty good examples. It's like Andrew Carnegie, who kind of knew a thing or two about going from the bottom to the top, said that people say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. He said, this is terrible advice. Put all your eggs in the basket, then watch the basket, right? Like, because
right.
it's, he made his money in steel. When you're trying to go, so especially for younger people, when you're trying to get up the ladder and you want to go as high as possible, you do that by concentrating. Sometimes that's investing. Sometimes that's in a small business. Sometimes that's just in your career and like crushing it as your career. I tell young people sometimes, if you can invest $500 in the stock market, or you can invest that in a credential that's going to eventually double your salary, right? Like concentrate on being really good at what you do. Once people had concentrated and succeeded, then they diversified. And that was the advice you would have found throughout most of history, was you start by concentration. As you succeed, you then diversify out of that concentration. You would not have wanted to diversify first and get distracted. There was a lot of terms for this. They called it being distracted by investing, or distracted by, or allured was another word they would use. P.T. Barnum, the circus mogul, which he knew how to separate people from their funds. He said, when a dentist hears that he can make more money doing literally anything other than drilling teeth, he will lose all of his money in South American bonds trying. And it's like, that's not an exact quote, but he's talking about bonds. He's talking South America. There's a rage for South American bonds that he's talking about. And that's the kind of thing that you don't want to diversify out of what you're really good at. Now, once you succeed, then you diversify. What has happened in the very recent era, because so much of people's retirement savings has done so well and has made many people wealthy via their retirement diversification, people have started to say that is the way you get wealthy. It may be, and it has worked out very, very well for this generation to have a diversified series of diversified asset base and just let it ride up. But that's actually fairly recent historically. I would absolutely want to be diversified in retirement. Like, no, I would be very fearful of someone concentrating everything in retirement, because that's a wonderful recipe for going broke. And it always was. But in terms of the climb up and what happens when you get there are two different phenomena.
You know what I love the way that you explained that, Joseph, is when you talked about concentration in your career field and staying in your lane and going deep and becoming one of the top experts in whatever it is that you're passionate about in your career field. Mm-hmm. Like, that's an aspect to concentration that maybe someone might not think about had you not brought it to our attention. And I think about how that applies today to us. We work with folks from all industries, but we also have a real concentration in the engineering field. And a lot of these engineering firms have got ESOP programs, and even some of the publicly traded ones, of course, have their own publicly traded stock. But the people that I've seen who have become dedicated to their career path, growing and expanding in what they're capable of. And I might add, now this isn't necessarily always the case, but the ones that were at one place and got to the top of their game and stayed and didn't jump around, which is also, I would consider concentration in maybe in number of employers. Now, if they're not giving you the opportunity and they're not giving you the upside, fine, I get it. You have to find something better. But I've seen a theme that people have become, even starting at the bottom, have been able to work themselves to a point and stick with something very concentrated. And in this case, it is financial. Some of those ESOP stocks that have been highly concentrated, they have made people wealthy far beyond what they could have ever imagined, to your point. But that was a combination of that financial instrument and also their capabilities, because while it was great that they happened to be at that firm that had that wonderful ESOP program, it also required them work really hard and diligent to earn the right and to provide value to that company to be there for 35 or 40 years as well. So it's really, thank you for sharing the concept of concentration, not just in somebody thinking, I'm just going to buy all NVIDIA stock or something. It's far more to it the way you explained it.
And thank you, because that's actually a very historic, that's the kind of insight you get from history you wouldn't get from reading financial literature today.
Yes.
Most people did not think of their financial life as existing on Wall Street. They thought of their financial life as existing in the town of Peoria, Illinois, or wherever, that they were, Wichita, Kansas. Like their financial life lived and existed there. So it was, what could I concentrate at getting good at? What could I concentrate at making money in? How could I use that then to diversify out into savings? But it was a very local financial life. Even if you lived in New York, it was a localized financial life. And so the move to kind of thinking of our financial life as kind of a retirement balance sheet that shows up once a quarter is a pretty new historical experience. So the way people would have thought about how to get ahead would have been like, well, of course, I concentrate on being excellent at what I do, and then I use that to increase the rewards that come with it.
Love it.
Yeah, we touched on retirement here just a little bit ago. So we've got an exhibit called The Perfect Retirement Number. And I don't know if you all remember, but some years ago, one of the big financial firms was running some commercials, and they had people like walking through airports and train stations and different places carrying a big sign that had a big number on it, like $1,364,282 and $2,365,000. The idea was that there is some perfect number out there that, gosh, once I hit that number, I can retire. I'm good to go. I'm not going to run out of money. So Joseph, what have you seen over time in terms of how people think about, is there a number there? Or even if I think there's a number and I hit that number, well, then I'm going to reset the goalpost. And now maybe I make it a bigger number. Or even if I have all the money that I could possibly ever need, I still have this anxiety about maybe I'm going to run out of money. So has there been any threads throughout history of how people have thought about that?
What a great, you guys have these great questions. I'm really having to like make sure I really think through all the facts here. So I think if you go back in time, it was not something people talked about with net worth. Net worth was not a concept most people had. My somewhat crass joke about this, with apologies, is that net worth really only matters 3 times. When you need to borrow from the bank, can you pay us back? When you die, who's going to get what? And when men want to impress each other. But like there is this kind of like, my number is, and it's like, okay, let's just start with George Washington did not know his net worth. That was not a concept that existed. It comes out of business accounting, and it only starts being applied to average families' money sometime in the early 20th century. So it's about 100 years old for using it for our purposes. Now, where you really found it was in probate court records. Like, you're dead, yes. Now what are you worth? That was the only time anybody cared. So what the real number is what they would have called, and every Jane Austen fan knows this, an estate worth. Meaning, what of the money of the wealth you have built, how much of a lifestyle can you drain off of that without killing it? And that's why the theme of a lot of Jane Austen novels are like men who spend profligately all the money away, and like women having to navigate that world. So in terms of what the number was, it was often seen as how much can you live on every year from your estate, not how much is the estate itself worth if it were to go to market. In fact, I saw, and there was a women's, one of those housewife manuals I talked about, in the early 20th century said, some people say you should measure like everything at its market value today. And she says, think about how ridiculous this would be. A woman at the end of every week would have to gauge the current market value of everything in the house based on its current condition and do it all again next week. No one's going to, they don't have spreadsheets, but like no one's going to do that. The real number that you need is the ability to live the lifestyle you've chosen in a level that you can sleep at night with. And I realize that sounds like an artful dodge, but when I'm in New York, this book tour has been really interesting because I spent a lot more time in Manhattan than I used to. I do, by the way, love the museum. In fact, when I'm there, I'll go to like the MoMA and I'll go to the, all the different art museums because it's something to do, like with a day when you have to kill a day. But as I explained to somebody, like I'm outside of Atlanta rich. I'm not Manhattan rich. And I'm okay with that. Like I could spend every waking hour anxious that I don't have enough, trying to earn and invest and all these things to get ahead of where I currently am. But there's a concept called enough. And I think people in history understood that pretty well, that you could hit a point of enough. And after enough, you could do things like give it away. You could do things like impart it to the next generation. A lot of that after enough was spent putting kids through school, by the way. There's a lot of 1/3 of families' lifetime income used to go to kids. So we think kids are expensive now. They've always been expensive. But my favorite example of this is a guy named Sylvester Judd. He's in the book. He's born the year the Constitution is ratified. He dies the year before the Civil War. He literally lived every year of antebellum America. Whole thing. He worked for half of it. Because in about his 30s, 40s, he sold a small business. He made enough and decided he had made enough to live a modest life and do what he was passionate about doing from there forward. And he did. And he wrote Histories of New England, which is actually why we know most of our history of New England, because he put it up. He got all the sources and collected them and put it down. So it wasn't that he wasn't working. He was working very diligently. He wasn't working for pay because he no longer had to, because he had enough.
Okay. So I'm going to call an audible here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to create a new exhibit that wasn't in my notes here.
Oh, goodness.
Because of what you just said. So I'm going to call this How Much Is Enough exhibit. And so, Joseph, I'd love to get your take on how do we determine what is enough? And historically, you mentioned people have thought about that a little bit. So I'd love to hear how people thought about how much is enough in the past, and how do you think people are thinking about how much is enough today? Because Bill, I mean, this is something that you and your team deal with every single day. I mean, people are retiring and they're wondering, do I have enough to retire? And so this is a huge, huge idea to think about. Of course, it varies for every person, but Joseph, I'd love to get the historical perspective on how people think about how much is enough.
So if you go back to that kind of pre-1912 world I talked about earlier, there was a general rule of thumb that you just took your estate and what you had and what it spun off at bond-like returns or dividend-like returns of, say, 5%. And you didn't think at all about the net worth of the thing. You thought entirely about how much does it cost me to live my life every year, and do I have enough passive bond income coming in to cover it? It was just as simple as that. Does grandma have enough to retire? Well, how much does it cost for her to live? How much comes in off of her investment portfolio? By the way, the other thing, and a lot of women were very heavily invested in mortgages, so they would lend out money to local homes. You can't do that as much anymore. Obviously, there's a major market for those mortgages, but women would have you into their parlor and lend you the mortgage for your house, and they would live on the payments, right, on the interest payments. So it was a simple equation of what does it take to live? What are the passive returns? We're just trying to bring those two things into balance. Now, what's happened since, say, 1982, 1983, as less and less stocks give dividends, for very good reasons, by the way. This is not a dividend advocacy idea. Sure. Just like for tax reasons largely, and for growing the business reasons, more and more of the return has come from the growth of the stock value itself, the valuation increase, which makes it something of a different puzzle because kind of post 1982, we're not really pulling passive income, we're pulling out speculative growth. And that's a very different thing. And so this is where the infamous Trinity study, or infamous, but like the very helpful Trinity study, and then the subsequent books about the 4% rule came out. And that you could kind of safely pull out 4% a year. Now, I do have a bit of a qualm with the 4% rule in that it's kind of based on a history that didn't really exist. So like you can't actually go back to the 1920s and decide you could pull out 4% returns with no fees and indexed returns because no one got no fee indexed returns. Like it's a thing that didn't exist in the past. So you're kind of hypothetically creating a world that didn't exist. But there's been, a lot of people say 4%. I actually look back on that history and think 4% is probably a little too cautious. I think, and there's been some revision work that says maybe you could safely take 5%. Psychologically, not historically, I think a lot of folks struggle with the decumulation phase because there's the fear of the first month you don't get a paycheck. And in the pension era, people didn't have that fear. You got another check, often from the same employer for a significantly lesser amount, but it was coming in. And that plus your Social Security, you could kind of combine it and go forward. So I can understand the psychological strain, but what I would tell people is like one of the real lessons from the past that you could take away is that there were people retiring before Social Security. And people think that's not true. It is absolutely true. I can show you a graph of people retiring by percentage of 65 and up retired. And the arrival of Social Security, the first Social Security check, is 1939 by a woman named Ida Fuller. She's in the newspaper cashing the first check. It's a blip. It hardly affects the graph at all because people had already been retiring since I found a letter from a guy in the 1840s that said, I cannot wait to retire to a villa in Florida. In the 1840s, there is not a road through Florida in 1840. You have to go by boat. And so what I mean by that is, so people were retiring. What were they doing? They were what I call retirement stacking. So they would, number one, if they could get an annuity, which is what Social Security is, they would buy an annuity. They would usually have a paid-for house to minimize their costs. And they would sell a business and get the residual income from sale of the business, or they would have bonds, maybe occasionally stocks, but mostly bonds that would steadily put out an income. And they would stack those things on top of each other. So their plan wasn't one thing. Again, back to diversify at the end. They were diversified at the end across a series of income streams. And combined, they could make a pretty good living. Fast forward to today. If you just tried to live only on the average 401k balance and you Monte Carlo simulate all the scenarios from 1870 today, it's very hard to live past 71 without running out of money. But when you combine 401k and Social Security and rental properties or business income or annuities or whatever you've stacked on top of each other, the most common outcome today is that you die with more money than you started with. So
That's right.
I think the number I'm sorry that I'm not giving you the number. I think the number is tied to what is your lifestyle and how can you stack enough income streams to live that lifestyle? Because my lifestyle may be very different in retirement than yours.
Yeah, and let's use you as a good example here, Joseph, because I think you did retire. And I think you told us before we hit the record button here that you're just a free throw away from 50.
Yep.
But you spent some time in retirement. So tell us a little bit about your experience there.
So back to concentration, I went all in on real estate after 2008. And the number of people who have rolled their eyes be like, well, of course you made money after 2008 in real estate. Now, try to tell them, like, it wasn't so clear that was going to work out in 2012. Like it wasn't the no-brainer that appears to be in you could find houses for cheap. Good luck finding someone to lend you the money. And so, different environment. But I did very well with that. It was part of the experiments of the book. And I ran a lot of experiments in this book. Take past financial advice, apply it to today. Does it work? This one worked really well. So I looked up in my early to mid 40s and was a multimillionaire, which was never the plan. I was a college professor on a college professor's salary. We do not make money. We make prestige. That is how they pay us. It's like they call us nice things and they let us speak to people. And I suddenly had more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. So I guess my number was $2.5 million. I can tell you that right now. And it was enough. It was enough because I come from rural South Carolina. My enough was a very different line than most people's that I interact with in the professional world. Now I could do anything I wanted with my free time. I am retired. And apparently, I didn't know this about myself, what I want to do when I'm retired is follow my wife around the house like I'm a puppy. Like I would like, well, what are you doing? You want to go do this? You want to go do that? And after about 2 years, she sat me down. She's like, I love you. You have got to get out of this house, right? I can sympathize with many retirees. That transition is real. It is a difficult thing to go from knowing every day who you are, what you do, even if there were days you didn't like being that and knowing what you were supposed to do. But now you are not handed a job description on day one of retirement. And you kind of have to feel it out. And you have to feel it out if you're married together and what it means that you're both in that space when you haven't always been in that space. So for me, retiring early was a really fun experiment in a way. Like I got to toy with it. And then I realized I need to be around people. And so I knew some people at Kennesaw State and I now teach college classes there to freshmen. I only teach the freshmen. I just like to teach the freshman survey because they're so young. And they just, and you can't really teach
impressionable.
And you can't really teach a survey. But I will tell you this, it made the book better because I would workshop some of my material like a stand-up comedian on a Tuesday night when no one's recording. Like I would try stuff out on them and see what their response was. And they hated it. They hated it because negativity is just the water they swim in. Woe is me is just the water they drink. It is and so for some middle-aged guy who didn't have to have this job to tell them that it's going to be great and it's never been easier than it is today was offensive. And instead of getting defensive about that, I said, okay, wow, I'm learning something. They are not able to hear this because of the way I'm talking about it. And so I went back and rewrote a lot of passages to say, like, how can I get a 29-year-old or a 19-year-old who has been told the whole system is broken, all the money all the rungs on the ladder to success were cut off by the people who got here before you, and you've got no shot at owning a house, at retiring, at having a career, AI's taking your job. How can I tell this person, historically speaking, I have the receipts, and you are living in the greatest age to be alive in human history. It has never been easier to get ahead than it is for you right now. And thankfully, that by being able to talk to them and express to their concerns, I was doing another podcast, obviously, a great podcast like this one, right? But it was millennials. So whereas your audience is more retirement, this is the other end of the spectrum. This is geared at millennials and their money. Great show called 2 Cents. And And I sit down with them. It's a young couple. The whole crew is millennials. The camera guy, the light guy, the sound guy, the producer. I'm like, oh, I am the only old person in this room. This may not go well. And I talked to them about, it's never been easier to get ahead than right now. I can find the American dream is dead 300 years before I can find the phrase American dream. Like I can find the colonists of Virginia saying that nobody gets ahead anymore. I can find people in the 1800s. I have a book. I actually have it here. I think maybe I've shared this with Steve before. Like I have a book written in 1984, sold almost 100,000 copies, that said that the middle class is dead and the baby boomers cannot retire and never will. How'd that turn out? So when I walk them through this and I get done, and these kids are like walking up to me and asking questions and I thought they were going to kill me. I thought they were going to surround me and beat me. And I leave, and the producer emailed me. He said, every single person in the crew, put your book in their cart because they need an optimistic message, but absolutely no one is getting rewarded for telling them. No one is saying you can do what other generations do, and it might actually be easier for you to do it. And so I think we're in an era that has just been, I call it big woe, the despair industrial complex, that has just inundated us with negativity. And we have got to step back and go, whoa, is this real? Because actually, historically speaking, congratulations, you live in the best moment ever to be alive.
Yeah, and I agree with that in the sense that if you're someone who wants to get ahead, the tools that are available today from the internet, from AI, from mass communication, from funding sources, people that want to help, it's greater today than it's ever been. And so the only thing I think, well, I shouldn't say the only thing. I mean, I understand, people, start from difficult places. I totally understand that. But if you have the desire to do it, there are so many opportunities to get ahead in the world today. So appreciate you sharing that. The one thing I want to ask, though, to kind of follow on from what you were just talking about here with you retiring early, is Bill, you work with clients for decades on retiring. Sure. I'd love for you a little, after the fact here, if Joseph came to you before he gave up his teaching job, his professorship, and said, look, I just made several $1 million in real estate. I'm thinking about, I'm ready to retire. I'm in my mid 40s. What would you be saying to someone like that based on your experience about, I kind of have an idea of what I think your next few years might look like if this is what you're thinking. So here's just a few tidbits for you to chew on before you actually make that decision to retire. What are some things you would have said to him?
Yeah, one of the first things I thought of when you were mentioning about the time in your house with your wife is I have a little cartoonist that did some work in my book, and it says, it's a cartoon of a man and a woman talking over the table, and it said, we said till death do us part in sickness and health, but not for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If you remember that one, Steve, and that resonates with a lot of our clients and readers of our work. So that is something people I've seen thousands of people now retire over my 35-year career. One thing was retiring in your mid 40s. The resources that you have are going to have to last a lot longer than somebody retiring in their mid 60s. Mm-hmm. So being aware of that and understanding what other potential sources of income would be coming down the road, if any, doesn't have to be, and looking at that. We always say we want folks to get, when I say truthful, and I wouldn't say this to Joseph because I would know he would have known this. Dr. Moore would have known these things about where he stands, but you talked about it earlier. When I say truthful, I don't mean people are being untruthful. I just mean some people don't have it nailed down. They haven't looked. They're maybe disorganized in understanding what are your actual resources and your liabilities and the things that you want to accomplish in your life. What really is your purpose in this next phase? Like, what is your purpose? How would you live your life if you knew you only had 5 years to live? What would the things be? What would you choose to do that you find most important if you knew there weren't an endless number of summers and Christmases and so forth coming down the road? Not in a morbid way, but getting really conscious about how you want to spend the one thing that the great equalizer that we all share, and that's time, the most valuable commodity. And so those would be some of the things I would think. Of course, yes, making sure the financial resources were there. We understood what those would be able to generate in income, but also how do we want to be spending our time with who? Would we want to be doing those things, and what effect do we want to have on the world? And no judgment on anybody's passions, right? Everybody has their own paths. Those would be some of the things that I would be thinking about right off the bat for sure, Steve.
That's great advice, Bill. And by the way, especially, being honest, it's especially important for men because study after study after study, like women will form relationships. They will find ways to connect with each other, to connect with their community. Men, especially in retirement, struggle because they've spent most of their time doing something, right, that was highly productive.
That's right.
Especially if the kids are grown and there's no more sports to go into, and you do struggle with the sense of like, what am I supposed to do? It's not exclusively male, but it does skew male. One of my favorite things I found reading about retirement before we think there was retirement was we forget that Long Island used to be farmland, like all of it. There was no Brooklyn or not much of it in the early 1800s. And there's this woman who goes out to Long Island and her note, it's like in a diary or a letter, I think. And she says, it's filled with businessmen farming for something to do. Like there's all these businessmen who had retired from New York and like, I got nothing to do. And so they would go to Long Island and get like a hobby farm. And it's so important to have a purpose. And I talk, especially when I hear these fire movement aficionados and they just tell me how they're, I'm saving 45% of my income and I'm living on breadcrumbs. I'm like, when you get there, what are you going to do? And I think they must like, that'll solve itself. It actually doesn't solve itself. You have to have an intentionality about who you are in your community, whether you're a, referee for, girls basketball games, which is currently my second retirement strategy is I'm just going to go referee girls basketball games because I've raised 2 girl basketball players. But like, you got to find something that you feel like you can contribute and has meaning. And if you don't, it doesn't really matter what the number is.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up here, have a purpose, have a reason to get up in the morning and feel like you're making a contribution, and don't drive your wife or your spouse nuts by having trying to alphabetize the spice rack for the 5th time type thing. So appreciate that. So the book here, How to Get Rich in American History, 300 Years of Financial Advice That Worked and Didn't. Dr. Joseph Moore, the author, we very much appreciate you being on the show today. Encourage folks listening to this to go grab your copy of the book, and you will get to some more details about the things that we talked about here today. So Joseph, thank you. Bill, thank you as always. And for all of you listening, if you want to learn more or ask us a question, just go to keenwealthadvisors.com. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that already. And also check out the Keen Wealth Advisors YouTube channel and make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you like this video as well. Please tell all your friends and colleagues about what we're doing here. We love to share the message about financial literacy and retirement and all the good things that can happen in that stage of your life. So appreciate it. And we'll catch you all on the next episode of Keen on Retirement.
Thanks, Dr. Moore. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody.
Bill, Steve, wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. And thanks for helping so many people.
The Steve Sandusky Advisor Network, Belay Advisor, and Dr. Joseph Moore are not affiliated with Keen Wealth Advisors. Opinions expressed by Steve are his own and not necessarily the opinions of Keen Wealth Advisors. Keen Wealth Advisors is an SEC-registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Keen Wealth Advisors and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. The contents of this podcast are intended for the residents of the United States of America. No advice may be rendered by Keen Wealth Advisors unless a client service agreement is in place. This program is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as advice on or a recommendation of any particular investment, strategy, or as tax or legal advice for your specific situation. Keen Wealth Advisors is not a tax or legal advisor. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your licensed professional prior to investing. Information in this program was compiled from sources believed to be reliable. Due to the constant state of data changing, we do not guarantee the timeliness or the accuracy of the information provided. Our views or opinions at the time you are listening to the podcast may be different than they were when the podcast was recorded. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Any indices referenced for comparison are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. Any prices that are referenced or market forecasts are as of the date stated and are not necessarily our opinions moving forward. As always, please remember, investing involves risk and possible loss of principal capital. This podcast is not allowed to be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced without permission from Keen Wealth Advisors.